Last summer I travelled to the Greek city of Hipparta on the slopes of Mount Ita, hoping to make a good deal on some cheeses. The town has one of the biggest markets in Thessaly, which, as I'm sure you know, is a region renowned as the home of magic and witchcraft. Unfortunately, I was out of luck that day. All the cheeses I had hoped to buy were sold out, and I could find no buyers for my own cheese or honey. Disappointed, I decided to cheer myself up with a visit to the public baths, and let the slaves and their strigils scrape away my frustration along with the sweat and dirt of the road. I made my way across town to the baths, but just as I was about to go in, a beggar sitting by the side of the road caught my attention. I could not say exactly what prompted me to stop and peer more closely at the pale, thin figure sitting in the dust just outside the entrance, half covered with a filthy, tattered cloak. I suppose some part of me registered a flicker of recognition as I hurried past, enough to make me hesitate and look more closely. When I did, I was astonished to see the much-changed face of one of my oldest and dearest friends who had gone missing several years ago. "Socrates!" I cried, for he shared his name with the famous philosopher, though my friend was perhaps not quite so renowned for wisdom. "Is that you? Is it possible?" He raised heavy-lidded eyes to look up at me, and a look of shock, horror, embarrassment, and pleasure all at once spread across his face. "Aristomenes!" he cried out in return. "You have no idea how good it is to see you, my friend." "Socrates, what are you doing here?" I demanded, rather angrily, I must confess. "Have you committed some terrible crime and fled the scene? Are you in danger? Don't you realize that back at home we have all been mourning your death? Your poor wife has cried herself to sleep every night for a year. Your family have gone into mourning, your children are wards of the court, and your in-laws are pressuring your wife to remarry while she is still young. What happened to you?" "Oh, Aristomenes," moaned Socrates, "if you only knew what I have suffered." He pulled his ragged cloak over his face in shame, which had the unfortunate effect of uncovering the naked lower half of his body. "Well, tell me then," I demanded. I was tempted to carry on into the baths and leave him to his whining in the dirt, but I did not have it in me to be quite so cruel. Instead, I pulled him to his feet and took off my own cloak and wrapped it around him for modesty, before half carrying and half dragging him into the bathhouse with me. There, I paid for both of us to get the full treatment, making sure that the bathhouse slaves would be scraping Socrates' skin clean after our hot and cold plunges, not myself. The very pleasant bathhouse was equipped with a small laconicum sweating room where we were able to have a nice long rest, and Socrates slowly started to relax and to talk, and even laugh a little bit more like his old self again. I held off on pestering him for details of his long absence for now. I suspected that a good dinner and plenty of good Greek wine would loosen his tongue later. As we left the baths, I wrapped him once more in my own cloak and led him back to the inn where I was staying. "Look, Aristomenes," said Socrates as we passed a fast food place, the smell of duck stew floating enticingly across the evening air towards us. "Let's stop for some food here." "No, come on, Socrates, I've been travelling all day. I want to get to the inn where I'm staying, the one on the edge of town, and eat there," I told him crossly, thinking that he was in no position to be making demands. Socrates grumbled and muttered something I couldn't hear, but he carried on. Still, the closer we got to the place, the more he seemed to drag his feet, as if he did not want to walk a step further. "Come on, Socrates," I cried. "I will get you a pallet to sleep on the floor of my room. We will bring up some fresh stew and some strong wine, and you must tell me your story." We reached the place not long afterwards, and stopped at the food bar downstairs before making our way up to my room. The landlady was serving stew at the bar. She was middle-aged, but extraordinarily attractive. Her glistening dark curls showed not a hint of grey, but gleamed against the bright gold of her earrings. Her eyes shone, and what I could see of her body behind the bar was soft and rounded in all the right places. Her voice when she spoke was soft and lilting. I smiled at her, and she smiled rather beguilingly back at me. Socrates, however, shrank from her gaze and buried his face in his borrowed cloak. We each ate some flatbread topped with cheese and flavoured with garum, with some pomegranates on the side, and Socrates also wolfed down a portion of goat stew, one eye on the landlady the whole time, who returned his gaze with a stare like a bird of prey looking at its dinner. I tried the duck stew myself, for it had been a long and trying day, and I was almost as hungry as my friend. Luckily there was plenty of food to go around, and we both ate our fill. Then I procured a jug of wine and some water from our distractingly attractive hostess, and we took both upstairs to my room. A pallet was laid out for Socrates to sleep on, though for some reason the landlady had a look of disgust and disappointment on her face as she laid it out for us. But then she left the room and closed the door, and I poured Socrates some practically neat wine and finally persuaded him to share his story. You probably remember that I had gone to Macedonia for some months on business, Socrates said with a sigh. I had made plenty of money and stopped off at Larissa to see some spectacular gladiatorial games on my way back south. I suppose I must have thrown my cash around a bit too obviously at the games, for on the road from Larissa to here the next day I was attacked and robbed by bandits. They beat me black and blue and took just about everything but my life, leaving me to stumble along the road half naked for miles until I made it to this town and to this inn. I practically broke down the door begging for help. And then I thought all my prayers had been answered, for the landlady took me in, fed me a huge supper completely free of charge, for I had no money, of course, and promised me a bed for the night. Her name is Meroe, and as I found out later, she is notorious in this town. I ate my fill and she gave me a simple tunic to wear, and then I retired to the room in need of rest. But she followed me, and it soon became clear that she expected a different type of payment for her services to me. As you have seen, she is a very beautiful woman, so I had no particular objections and allowed myself to be pulled into the bed alongside her. But from that moment on, I felt my senses dulled. My mind began to sicken and my willpower disappeared. She had her way with me and then sent me up to a tiny room to sleep on this pallet, this right here that I am lying on. This has been my bed since that night. The next day she put me to work carrying bags, and I give her all the money I earn in return for scraps of clothes and dinner from leftovers. I spend all my time fetching and carrying in this inn until she sends me to the bathhouse when I get too smelly and my odour becomes off-putting for the guests. I know I should leave, but I cannot make myself do it. She has bewitched me, and her control over me is absolute. It is as if I exist in a tiny pocket of my own mind, and I am screaming at my body to just leave this place, just walk away and go home. But that part is trapped inside my head, and my body will not obey it. It was only when you greeted me at the bathhouse that I finally began to recover a bit of myself. "I have never heard such a sorry tale," I exclaimed. "What has possessed you to allow this woman to enslave you in this way?" "Are you not listening to me?" retorted Socrates, regaining some of his old colour. "The woman is a witch, Aristomenes. She has me under a spell, and I am powerless to go against her will." He suddenly looked around anxiously, staring at the walls and saying, "We must speak more quietly, for she hears everything." "You cannot seriously expect me to believe that this woman is a witch so powerful that she is able to exert complete control over a man's mind and body at all times," I said. "That would make her not a witch, but a goddess." "I swear to you it is true," said Socrates. "She is a powerful sorceress. She turned her last lover into a beaver for being unfaithful to her, and she turned a neighbour who annoyed her into a frog." He got better. "Did she really?" I said, for the first time becoming seriously concerned for Socrates' sanity. Still, it would not do to be too confident. As we were speaking, I saw a small black cat push open the door with its head and slink into the room. Was this the witch's familiar? It stared at me with its bright green eyes, and I began to be nervous. "Let's go to sleep, Socrates," I said. "I'm sure you're in need of rest, and then we can get out of here together first thing in the morning, and I'll take you home." But when I looked around, poor Socrates was already asleep, lying flat out on his little pallet. I pulled a blanket over him and gently shoved the cat out of the door, which I bolted firmly. I also barred the door and even pushed the head of my bed against it for good measure. It was not much of a bed, a rather old camping bed with a broken leg, but it was better than nothing. Then I lay down under the covers and fell into a fitful doze. I was awakened by a sudden crash on the other side of the door. Before I could get any sense of what was happening, I felt myself flung up into the air. The door came crashing inwards, bolts, bar and bed all smashed out of the way, flipping the light little bed up towards the ceiling and throwing me off it entirely. What goes up must come down, and the bed fell back to earth directly on top of me, pinning me underneath it like a trapped tortoise. I huddled under there, terrified, my head poking just far enough towards the edge to allow me to see what was happening in the room. The entrance was now clear, the door having been smashed in, and the bed and myself having fallen towards the wall, and in came two middle-aged women. One was Meroe, and although she looked the same as she had earlier, yet she somehow seemed less beautiful to me, as if a spell had been lifted. She was carrying a drawn sword in one hand, and, bizarrely, a sponge in the other. The second woman was carrying a lighted torch, and from her similarity in looks I guessed she must be Meroe's sister. "Look, Panthea," said Meroe, and her voice seemed now harsh and rasping. "Here he is, yet another unfaithful lover. He has been telling tales about me to this friend of his." Here she gestured to my hiding hole under the bed, but did not deign to look at me. "And tomorrow they plan to run away together. Well, we can't have that. You can be sure that both of them will sorely regret crossing me by noonday tomorrow." Panthea cackled like an old hag and said, "Shall we tear them to pieces at once, or shall we tie twine around their private parts and rip them off first?" Merowe grinned widely in the flickering torchlight. "Nothing so simple nor so quick," she said. "That little cockroach," this was directed at me, "can bury his friend and then flee justice to wherever he chooses, for you know there is no one in this town who will dare to cross my will." Having said this, she leaned over Socrates, and before I could react, she turned his head to one side and drove the sword through the left side of his neck. Socrates let out a strange, strangled gurgle, though from what I could see his windpipe had been sliced through. Blood spurted out, but she pulled out a small bladder and collected every last drop of it. Then she thrust her hand into the wound and down Socrates' throat, groped around his insides for a while, and eventually yanked out his heart from his body. As she pulled out the heart, Panthea took the sponge from her and shoved it into the hole in Socrates' throat, saying, "Sponge taken from the sea, beware of crossing running water." Merowe held up her gory trophy with a triumphant cry, and then the pair of them turned around and walked out of the door without a backward glance. I had barely managed to move a shaking finger out from my position under the bed when suddenly the door rose up by itself and put itself back in its place, the bar returning to where I had placed it earlier and the door relocking itself. I crawled out from under the toppled bed and stumbled towards the door, intending to flee, for I was sure those two hags would call the magistrates in the morning and report me for murder. But I did not get so far as the door before the shock of that night of horror caught up with me, and I fell down in a dead faint in the middle of the floor. I came to lying in a sticky puddle of drool on the floor sometime after dawn the next morning. For several minutes I just lay there, perfectly still, trying to put together what had happened last night. I was looking at the bed, which was still lying upside down in its topsy-turvy position by the wall. My back was to Socrates' body lying still behind me. Taking a few deep breaths, I steeled myself to push up to a sitting position, turn around, and look at my old friend. But I slipped on my own drool on the floor and fell on top of him instead. To my great astonishment, Socrates leapt up as I landed on him, crying, "Oof! What are you doing, Aristomenes?" I was so shocked I could barely breathe, and confused with it. I stared at him, taking in every inch of his body, which looked, if anything, healthier than it had last night. He stood tall, his arms and legs strong and healthy, smiling and laughing at me. I peered at his neck as closely as I could, and I thought that maybe I could just make out some scarring around his throat, but I could not get close enough to see properly. Then, when I was confident that it was really him, up and alive and walking about, I threw my arms around him and kissed him joyfully. All right, said Socrates. "You smell weird, like you've been sleeping on the floor or something." He glanced towards the upturned bed, but apparently thought better of asking more about it. "Must have been a bad dream," I said dismissively, ignoring the evidence before my eyes to the contrary. "Come on, let's get out of here as fast as we can." I was nervous about having to pay Merowe or her vile sister for our night's lodgings, and I was half convinced that one of them would appear and try to stop us leaving, or at least try to hang on to Socrates. But we saw neither of them, just a doorman who took our payment, and within half an hour we were on our way, striding out into the fresh morning air, down the road south and away from that cursed city that had brought us both so much trouble. Socrates recovered his spirits greatly as soon as we set foot upon the road, and was soon chatting happily about how much he was looking forward to seeing his wife and children again. After a little while we stopped under the shade of a big plane tree for a short rest. I stared once more at Socrates' throat, but now I could see no sign of scarring whatsoever. There was no indication that he had ever been wounded. I decided the whole thing must have been a terrible dream, and nothing more. "What are you staring at, Aristomenes?" demanded Socrates. "Nothing," I said. "I am only thinking that the doctors are right when they say if you stuff yourself with food last thing at night and then wash it down with strong wine, you will have nightmares. I had the most awful dream last night. It was so savage I almost feel as if I have been spattered with human blood." "You were just lying in a pool of your own drool," said Socrates with a wrinkled nose. "But I must admit I had an alarming dream last night as well. I dreamed that my throat was cut, and I could feel all the agony of the wound. And then I dreamed someone reached inside my neck and pulled my heart right out of my chest. It was terrifying. Just thinking about it is making me tremble." And he held up a shaking hand. "Let's have some breakfast," I said. "Some food in your stomach will perk you up a bit." I pulled out some bread and cheese, but as we settled down to eat, I couldn't help but notice that Socrates no longer looked quite as healthy as he had this morning. The more he ate, the more he turned the pale colour of boxwood, and his cheeks were starting to look gaunt, his position hunched. I tried to eat a piece of bread, but it stuck in my throat. I was worried for my friend, and I was also becoming increasingly nervous for myself. There were quite a few people on the road by this time, and if anyone saw my companion drop dead beside me, they were sure to suspect foul play. Meanwhile, Socrates was just eating and eating. He ate a whole loaf of bread and nearly a whole cheese, looking more and more sick the more he ate. "I'm thirsty," said Socrates. I looked around and saw a fresh running stream not far from the roots of the tree, a little distance from the road. The water was crystal clear, and I could see no signs of dead animals nearby, so I led Socrates over to the brook and encouraged him to drink as much as he needed. He sank down gratefully by the water's edge, bent his head forward, and began to drink. But his lips had barely touched the water when the sponge fell out of his throat and dropped with a plop into the water, exposing the gaping, bloody wound for all to see. Socrates started to go in after it, but I grabbed at his leg and pulled him backwards and onto the bank. I turned him onto his back, called out his name and tapped his face for signs of life, but there were none. He was stone cold dead. I buried him as quickly as I could with a few hasty prayers and ran off into the hills, avoiding the roads until I could be sure I was a long way from his body. And so the two witches' punishment of me was complete, for my friend's open, vacant expression and the jagged wound in his throat will haunt me until the day I die. The end. Welcome back to Creepy Classics, the podcast retelling ancient, medieval and early modern ghost stories. I'm Juliet, and we have another story from ancient Rome this month, or rather from the ancient Roman world. Apuleius of Medaris is one of my absolute favourite ancient authors. He's from North Africa, he's a Roman citizen, he travelled widely throughout Greece and Italy as well as North Africa itself. He wrote in both Greek and Latin, but only the works written in Latin have survived. And this story is from his novel Metamorphoses, although it's not about the main protagonist of the novel. It's a shorter story told within the overall story of the novel. Metamorphoses is my favourite ancient text, or one of my favourite ancient texts, and this is the third story I've adapted from this one novel. It's full of shorter stories within the overall story. That's kind of part of the narrative structure. It's a fairly common narrative structure in ancient literature. The Odyssey is kind of written that way. So anyway, this is the third ghost story, or in this case, I guess, more witches and sort of undead story that I've adapted from that novel. I can't remember if there are any more. I think I've done the main two, which is this one and the very first one I ever did on this podcast, which also involved a witch, and I've done the story of Thessaly last year. There may be one or two more, though, still to adapt from this novel. Apuleius liked ghosts and witches as much as I do. He was actually accused of witchcraft himself. He was put on trial for using witchcraft to persuade his wealthy wife to marry him. We have his speech written in his own defence, and we assume, because we have that speech, therefore, that he was found not guilty, because you would not have the defence speech if the person had been found guilty. But that tells us quite a lot about him, obviously, and his fascination and interest in witchcraft and stories about witchcraft and ghosts and things is kind of fairly clear. And I've talked about ancient witchcraft before. Also in the episode of the podcast on Erichtho from Lucan's Civil War, I talked about witchcraft. That was a while back. Cats as witches' familiars aren't particularly common in Greece and Rome. I thought about using a weasel, which might be kind of more accurate to Greece or Rome, but I thought a cat is more immediately obvious to modern readers, and although the story is set in Greece and the characters, Aristomenes and Socrates, are Greek, Apuleius the writer is North African, and cats were more significant, particularly in Egypt and in North Africa. So I figured that was reason enough to make it a cat rather than a weasel. This story is quite similar in some ways to the story of the two friends at the inn from Cicero, and that's partly why I waited so long to do this story. I've been thinking of adapting this story ever since I started the podcast in 2019. But I did the story of two friends where one of them stays at the inn and one of them doesn't, and the one staying at the inn gets murdered. I did that one ages and ages ago, a story from Cicero. So I didn't want to do this one too soon after that one because they're not the same, but there are some similarities. I've tried to make sense of what is deliberately a fairly nonsensical plot. It's supposed to be a silly story. Metamorphoses is a comic novel, and it has parts in it that are more comic or more serious than other parts because it has all of these kind of embedded narratives and shorter stories within the main story. Some of it is kind of more romantic or tragic, some of it is spookier or scarier, some of it's more broadly comedic. But this is more broadly comedic. This is the very first story of the novel. The main character of the novel, Lucius, meets Aristomenes and another man on the road, and Aristomenes tells this story. And they're actually going to Hipparta, which is Ipati, in modern Greece. They're going there at the time, and then that's where the main part, the kind of first part of the main story takes place in Hipparta as well. So this is actually the reader's introduction to the novel, and it sets the tone for the novel, which is it's about magic and witchcraft, and it's kind of silly and a little bit scary, and, you know, a lot of kind of wacky stuff is going to happen in this novel. So Apuleius' version of this story is more broadly comedic than mine. I wanted to keep some of the humour. I kept the bit about Socrates' cloak revealing his naked lower half because I thought that was funny. I threw in a Monty Python reference that I didn't even write when I wrote the story. I literally threw that in as I was recording because I couldn't resist. So I have aimed to keep some of the humour, but I made my story a little bit more of a kind of creepy, quite gross out, scary story with some humour rather than a really broad comedy. So in doing so, I have cut it down a bit. One thing I cut out because it just isn't my taste, some of the gross out humour. When the witches have killed Socrates and put the sponge in, before they leave, they urinate all over Aristomenes, and then he wakes up in like this sticky pile of wee, and that's what he smells of. Socrates is like, oh, you smell, because he smells of wee. And it's also a clue that everything did all really happen, although Socrates thinks he's just like wet himself in the night. And all of that just didn't really fit the tone I was going for, and it's just not entirely to my personal taste. So I kind of cut that bit. I cut a whole section with the doorkeeper where Aristomenes wakes up and he tries to leave and the doorkeeper won't let him out, and he's convinced he's going to get charged with murder. And then I fell down a rabbit hole kind of working, or why does he think he's going to get charged with murder? Like, who's going to come after him? Presumably he thinks that Meroe and Panthea are going to report him to the magistrates. Anyway, he then tries to end his own life, and then he falls on top of Socrates and Socrates wakes up. And I kind of cut down that section. I wanted to focus more on the witchcraft and the witches and undead Socrates and so on, and not have this massive long section with Aristomenes just like stressing. I did also cut down a bit on some of the things that Socrates says Meroe has done. She's notorious as a witch in this town. Again, why Aristomenes thinks anyone's going to believe her if she reports him for murder doesn't quite make sense. I kept the beaver and the frog. But there was other stuff as well. A barrister who was supposed to prosecute her got given ram's horns, and now he bleats his case in court. She made a woman perpetually pregnant. Oh, and then there's a bit where she's like made an entire palace like move, which I suppose is foreshadowing for her moving the door and the bed, but it was just a bit kind of, it was going to be a bit too broad for my story. I was trying to have my story be a tiny bit more grounded than that, and it just seemed a bit kind of it didn't quite fit the tone I was going for, so that's why I cut some of those sections down. Meroe or Meroe is a Greek name, but it is the same as the name of a city in Sudan, which was at that time in the kingdom of Kush. So not far from the Nile, but in the kingdom of Kush rather than in Egypt. This may or may not be meant to indicate the witch is African. It was also a Greek name, so it might just be a coincidence. Apuleius was from North Africa. It might have been a deliberate reference to the city. Egypt was heavily associated with magic in the Roman world, so Kush, is next to Egypt and shared some cultural similarities. The kingdom of Kush, they also had like pyramids and mummies and stuff, so it might have been a deliberate reference or it might not. Socrates is perfectly happy to sleep with Meroe before he realises he's been enchanted. Adultery in the Roman world was a very specific crime involving a respectable citizen's wife or daughter or mother sleeping with a man she's not married to, or a man sleeping with another man's wife, daughter, or mother. So adultery only referred to cheating if it endangered the marriage of citizens and made it so that a citizen man did not know who the father of his children was. That's the key issue. So a man sleeping with anybody who is not the wife, daughter, or mother of another citizen is totally fine. A woman sleeping with another woman is pretty much fine. That's not going to bother them too much. But a wife, a daughter, or a mother sleeping with a man who might get her pregnant, so anybody not a eunuch, and who is male, that would be adultery. And for a man, sleeping with another man's wife is adultery because you're then making their children's legitimacy called into question. But Meroe is not the wife, daughter, or mother of a respectable citizen, so she does not count as adultery. Aristomenes may be afraid of being prosecuted under the same law that Apuleius himself was probably prosecuted under, which is the Lex Cornelia de Sicariis et Veneficis. This is a law against poison and murder. So Apuleius, we're not sure exactly what law he was charged under for witchcraft, but we think it was probably this law because it would have come under the poisoning part of the law, but it was also a law against murder, and it was primarily a law against murder and attempted murder and essentially physically harming somebody else on purpose. But poison is one way of doing that, and witchcraft is related to poison. Augustus had instituted watchmen in Rome, and Apuleius seems to be assuming that this system also exists in Hipparta, possibly, plausibly. Hipparta's in Greece, where the systems would have been slightly different than the city of Rome, but probably similar by this point. The night watchman protected the peace at night and would report something as serious as murder to the prefect, who would then carry out the arrest. And later there is another scene also set in Hipparta where the main character, Lucius, is arrested for murder by the magistrate and his lictors, who are the kind of minions who symbolise the power of the magistrate. Meroe is described as beautiful, but ancient authors often avoid describing exactly what beautiful women look like. They'll say they're beautiful, but they don't say what is beautiful about them. And Apuleius does not say what is beautiful about Meroe. All he says is that she's no longer young. Later in the novel, he tells the story of Cupid and Psyche. Psyche is the most beautiful girl in the world, and she is also described as looking like a goddess, but with no actual physical details. And this was a bit of a challenge for me because modern readers of English language literature tend to expect physical descriptions of characters, and especially if they're described as beautiful or handsome. I think when we read a modern story and a character is especially attractive, we sort of expect a physical description of what they look like that's so attractive. So I'm then trying to come up with a physical description that's going to make sense. And I was like, okay, well, this story is set in ancient Greece, in Roman-occupied Greece. So it needs to be what a Greek man, Aristomenes, the character telling the story, is a Greek man. So it needs to be what he would find attractive. But it's in a novel by Apuleius, who's a North African Roman citizen. So do I need African beauty standards, North African beauty standards, Roman beauty standards, Greek beauty standards? Are they different? How similar are they? Oh, it was a nightmare. Helen of Troy is described as having shining or lovely hair or curly hair, a tradition developed of describing her as blonde in later authors. So Euripides says she's xanthus, which is either blonde or redhead. There is a Roman fresco that's been discovered fairly recently that shows her with red hair. Most images of Helen of Troy actually show her with brown or dark hair. In the case of red and black figure vases, that's probably easier. But in frescoes as well, Roman frescoes, she actually usually has brown hair. But there was a literary tradition of describing her as being blonde. But Homer just says, like, shining or lovely. She has white arms because that indicates that she's aristocratic and doesn't have to go outside to work and therefore is not tanned. And she's tall, which makes her like a goddess. Gods and goddesses are taller than ordinary mortals. So Helen of Troy is tall because she's goddess-like, and she wears gold or silver clothes and jewellery. She looks like a goddess, and she's aristocratic, and those are the factors that are driving the physical description of her. We can also see in statues and mosaics and so on of beautiful women from Greece and Rome that fuller figures tend to be considered more beautiful, which makes sense. You want somebody healthy with wide hips to be able to have children, preferably without dying in the process. Excessive thinness would suggest hunger, so thin or slim would not be part of the beauty standards in the ancient world. Medical texts suggest that the ideal female body is soft and round, so that's why I described Meroe as kind of soft and round in the right way, that's what, for a Greek or a Roman, is kind of the ideal female body. I decided to give her glistening but dark hair so that it's kind of shining but not actually blonde, especially since she shares her name with an African city and she's in Greece, and I was like, yeah, no, let's not go with blonde, let's go with dark hair. And then I described her figure as kind of like those ancient statues and went with that as an option. I kind of wish that we didn't have this tendency in modern writing to give such detailed physical descriptions all the time. I actually like not doing that, and I don't actually do it all that much. I prefer to let readers imagine what the character looks like in their own heads, unless it's important for the story in some way. I mean, obviously in a Game of Thrones, you have to describe everybody's hair colour because it's literally a plot point. So if it's important to the story, that's different. But if it's not important to the story, I like people to be able to imagine the characters however they want, but I'm aware that there is a kind of a tendency, a fashion, whatever you want to call it, in modern literature. People like to have a physical description and be able to picture the characters with hair colour, eye colour, whatever else. So, yeah. I thought that because she's specifically described as beautiful, I had better give an actual physical description of what's beautiful about her. Hipparta is in Greece, modern Ipati, but this story is set during the Roman period, so it has Roman businesses and amenities like public baths, which are specifically mentioned in the story. And the bathhouse was pretty similar across the empire, with variations depending on size, local climate, and so on. So, for example, at Wroxeter in England, which is Wiriconium, the Roman city, they had an indoor basilica rather than an outdoor palaestra for exercising because the climate in Britain is not so good and there's more rain. But the basic setup would be the same wherever you would go. There's an apoditerium, which is the entrance room where you store your clothes, the tepidarium, which is the warm room, the caldarium, which is the hot room, then the frigidarium, which is the cold room, and you go through them in that order. Then you go back to the tepidarium for a massage with oils and scraping with strigils, which are those metal implements that you scrape the sweat and the dirt off with. And you could get your friends to do it, or you could have a slave do it. Some baths also contained a laconicum, which is a dry resting room for sweating, so it's basically a sauna, and many of them had a palaestra for exercise, and some of them had a bigger swimming pool. There is a thermal hot spring at Dipati, but Apuleius doesn't mention it. I don't know if he actually went there. He did travel in Greece, but whether he went to Hipparta, I don't know. I wasn't sure how near the spring was to the ancient town centre, so I left out mention of it. But chances are there was a bathhouse at the spring, like the baths at Bath, Roman Aquae Sulis in England. The Romans did also have fast food. Apuleius refers to the inn as just hospitium, which is a vague term that doesn't really indicate exactly what it was. There were more specific terms for specific types of inn, like taverna or carpona, but they all likely served food and wine. And you could also go to a thermopolium, a hot food place, which could be on the ground floor of an apartment building or in various inns or taverns, or it could be a separate business. People living in apartment buildings in urban areas would have relied on these places to eat because they didn't have anywhere to cook in their apartments. So they would have to go to this basically fast food joint to get their food, and travellers would as well, of course. They served a range of foods that could be cooked and kept hot or cold in dolia, which are big jars, which would be embedded in the bar around the outside of the shop, and then you could eat it straight away. And the food included various stews, duck, fish, pork, goat, snail, and so on. Possibly other things, maybe fried fish or snails, maybe Roman pizza, like we've seen an image of from Pompeii. Possibly more likely at a bakery, because you'd have to bake the bread, but I decided to include it in my inn's food, which is very possible as well. So it's basically a flatbread with things on it. And there were drinks, mostly wine, available as well. Romans drank wine with water, only barbarians drink it neat, so strong wine is wine with not much water in it. And garum was the Roman fish sauce that some people like to put on everything, the same way some people now, including me, put ketchup on everything. If you would like to read more, there is a very good translation of Metamorphoses by Robert Graves, so it's quite old. But the Penguin translation, Lucius Apuleius, The Golden Ass. I don't know if Penguin have actually done a more up-to-date translation since this one. I've got quite an old copy. The Golden Ass is a title by which Metamorphoses is often known to differentiate it from Ovid's Metamorphoses. I like Apuleius a lot more than I like Ovid. I don't see why Ovid should get to keep the title, so I prefer to use the title Metamorphoses. But if you see references to The Golden Ass, that is the same novel. It's just a different name for it. And I like Robert Graves' translation. There may be a more recent Penguin one as well, though. I also have a copy of Apuleius Metamorphoses, an intermediate Latin reader by Paul Murgatroyd, which is very good if you are studying Latin. It gives you short sections from the text and commentary and notes, and you can kind of basically read it in Latin. It's an intermediate reader, like it says. It's really good. A lot of the research for this is not research I did specifically for this story. Like, my knowledge of ancient medical texts is just, I've been studying this stuff for 25 years and some of this is just stuff I know. But I did look up various things. Laurie Maguire's Helen of Troy From Homer to Hollywood is very interesting on beauty standards and on Helen of Troy specifically. I had a look at Roman Justice and Apuleius Metamorphoses by Richard G. Summers from Transactions and Proceedings of the American Philological Association from 1970. And several websites just with details about some of the fast food places and bathhouses and so on. So I had a look at an article from unrv.com on inns and taverns. 2 Max Miller videos from YouTube. He's done loads of videos on ancient Roman food. He did one on Roman fast food specifically and one on the Roman pizza. But he's got a whole playlist of ancient food, which I thoroughly recommend. And an article from heritagedaily.com on Roman fast food as well. And the fresco of Helen of Troy with red hair was a very recent discovery in 2024. I think the Smithsonian had an article on that. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I do hope you enjoyed it. For more ghost stories, sign up for my Patreon, Juliet Harrisson, Juliette, Harrison with 2 R's and 2 S's. Weirdly spelled name. But do sign up to my Patreon. I adapt in written form a 19th or 20th century ghost story each month on the Patreon. And at the moment, I am in the middle of a multi-parter. It's going to have either 2 or 3 parts. We'll see how it goes when I write part 2. It is a Jane Austen-style Regency romance with a ghost. There is a family ghost haunting this young couple who fall in love, but there are social and financial issues in their way. So if that sounds fun to you, do go sign up for my Patreon. You can read part 1 on there now, and part 2 will be coming out later this month. And I also post monthly dog walking vlogs, although I've got July's filmed already. I don't know what I'm going to do for August if these heat waves don't ease off. It's going to be a night walk or something, but anyway. You can also check out either my Patreon or my Substack for my latest newsletter, where I did talk a bit more about Helen of Troy, if that's something that you're interested in. I am going to go and see the movie The Odyssey tomorrow, and I will be talking about the movie on my main YouTube channel. I have like 3 YouTube channels, but the main one is the Classical JG channel. I am going to talk about the new Odyssey movie on there, as well as The Return, which is a movie that came out a couple of years back, which is also an Odyssey adaptation, and probably the Odyssey itself. So if you're interested in the whole Helen of Troy beauty thing, I didn't go into it in too much detail here because I'll just end up repeating myself, but do check out the Substack or the Patreon, or keep an eye out for the YouTube video when that goes up on the Classical JG YouTube channel. And as ever, if you'd like to support the podcast, do sign up for the Patreon or pick up one of the books which collect stories originally told on this podcast. We have 4 books now, collections of short stories, which are, they're all creepy classics, and then subtitles: Ghost Stories from Ancient Rome, Ghost Stories from Ancient Greece, Medieval Ghost Stories, and Haunting Tales for Winter. They're available from Kobo, Amazon, Barnes & Noble for paperback, or Amazon for paperback, Apple, Fable, all the places. Thank you once again for listening. I hope you're having a good day. I hope this new movie is good. It's going to be really long, so I hope it's not boring. And I'll be back next month with another ancient, medieval, or early modern ghost story. So until then, have a great day, and thank you for listening. Creepy Classics is written and performed by Ed Harrisson, music composed and performed by Ed Harrisson, and it's produced by Ed Harrisson.